Here is Van Dieman's Bass Strait Cobalt. And as the name states, this is a cobalt blue in the writing sample, and it looks exactly like the swatch. And in the chromatography, you see a little bit of purple at the bottom. Now, there is a noticeable tone shift as papers change, enough tone shift that you don't need a side-by-side to really be able to see it. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it doesn't tend to feather, but it does show some aggression as it gets deep into the paper. I would recommend it for student note takers because of the aggression. I said would, I probably wouldn't. That's what I meant. Because I know I can get great cobalt blues without any aggression, that's the only reason that I would pass on this ink.
The pen for today is a Cross Wanderlust. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Beautiful cobalt blue on the page that does not feather, does not spread, does shade incredibly well, really alerting you to what's happening within the writing. Look at alerted on the first line, where the ALE is a bit darker than that R that lightened up a bit. TED at the end becomes a bit darker again. Where reader, the RADER are a lighter tone than the E right in the middle. Something that looks very nice when we get that nice darker, but not a ton darker, letter like that also on the first line. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Van Dieman's makes more than just this one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Van Dieman's.
Here is Van Dieman's Pink Fairy Orchid. Here is Van Dieman's Apricot. Here is Van Dieman Hasting Caves Shimmering Ink.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here the tone is lighter than we get on the Clairfontaine, a couple of tones lighter. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does not shade here at all, does give a very noticeably vivid blue, really looks good on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we don't have a ghosting problem necessarily. We have an aggression into the paper problem. It doesn't bleed through to the page underneath, but I don't know that I would take notes back here with it really having so many spots that are so deep into the paper.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here is an entirely different shade of blue within, I guess, that cobalt family. Very noticeably, you don't need it side by side to be able to see it at all. This is definitely being affected by the tone of the paper, though it is not making it more green leaning, it is definitely making it a whole lot lighter. There are some tiny feathers that do occur at times. They're not being a major problem. I think this is really some of the only case we're going to get it. It doesn't spread. It does have some shading that's going on, though while it's a little more, it's easier to see here, I don't think it's nicer than we saw on other papers. Easier to see as in proof on the first line, where the P is noticeably darker than the RU in the middle, where it gets a bit darker with the F at the end. Looking at the back of the page, ghosting's not the biggest problem. I'm going to say there's a slight problem with it. The real problem we get here is the inky aggression into the page, as I just continue to circle these spots where it got very, very deep, making it so you could not write on the back of the page if you wanted to. However, it did not bleed through to the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here the tone is ever so slightly lighter, but it comes across as a bit brighter than it did on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. really stands out well against the quad rule. I think this ink on this paper looks absolutely fantastic. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting is not a problem, but the pencil's out. So deep penetration into the page is a problem. A lot of spots where they're very deep. I think it probably is going to be more noticeable to me. I didn't even get all of them. I see a couple there. Probably lets people write on the back of the page because the spots are so tiny, but this is coated paper, so it's something to be aware of. None of this bled through to touch the page underneath.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more blue inks that are out there.
Here is Diatramentis Robert Louis Stevenson South Sea Blue. Here is Levenger Blue Bahama. Here is Noodler's Texas Blue Bonnet. Here is Pilot Suyu Kusu or Asiatic Dayflower.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is a bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. I don't want to call it flatter because it is still a very lively blue on the page. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade very well, making statements out of what you're writing in your notes. Really looks fantastic. I think it stands out against the quad rule with no problems at all. This, if you're a student using it, is an excellent ink in your notes, and you probably deserve a few bonus points. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, showing why, even when an ink can be a little more aggressive on many papers, this paper is perfect for student note-taking.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Lamy Rhodonite. Here is Monteverde Mandarin Orange. Here is Dieman Wine Divine. Here is J. Herban Amber de Bermini.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter than we get on the Clairfontaine. We don't get feathering. We do get just a little spread. I want to say the spread is a little bit less than we would normally get for on copy paper, making this excellent for use here. We do see a little bit of shading, but I don't tend to really go after the shading a ton when it comes to copy paper. I'm much more after a decent use in terms of its feather spread or over penetration, but the shading is still there. Looking at the back of the page, not a problem for ghosting. Yes, it does have a number of spots. It gets deeper into the paper, but this is copy paper, so I have a lot more leeway here. I would not write back here, but I do think this could be an ink for this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow fine of the Cross Wanderlust gives a nice, vibrant cobalt blue that shades well enough. Now, off camera, I tried this in a wet fine to see a brighter and more full-bodied cobalt blue. It darkened a tad from its darker tones in the shading. It gave a good, solid, bright cobalt blue with little to no shading. I say go for a medium flow, broad, or stub to really show off some of the shading with a bright, bright cobalt blue.